Hello everyone, this is part 17 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Fu had to catch herself on the wooden wall again as the floor beneath her feet lurched, nearly throwing her to the floor. For somebody with such a naturally dark and caramel complexion, she looked unusually pale as she staggered through the corridor, constantly having to use a hand to steady herself. She had found out recently that she hated ships, with a passion. The constant rocking motion left her disoriented and dizzy as her stomach churned with nausea. Currently she and Naruto were on a rather large ship traveling from the northeast coast of Mizu no Kuni, around Kaminari no Kuni's peninsula and onward to Tsuchi no Kuni. She moved out onto the deck of the ship with weak legs, doing her best not to tremble slightly. Out here in the fresh air, at least she felt a modi of control return to her limbs, as long as she secured herself with chakra to avoid being thrown around by the rocking waves. She peered up at the bright sun shining down on them overhead, reflecting off the surrounding waters to give everything rather annoying glare. She had to put a hand above her eyes just to peer about the deck, not that there were many people around up here. Sure enough, she sighed as she spotted the person she had been looking for. Naruto was where he always was, at least since coming aboard. He stood at the railing, just staring out at the sea with dull, unseeing eyes. He had been this way ever since Shizuku had he had barely even spoken a word to anybody. They had left the rebel camp as soon as they had dropped off Yagura's body. Fu figured it was because the camp reminded him too much of all the time he had spent with Shizuku there. They weren't stopped, mostly because everybody was just too shocked that Yagura was to do anything. By the time Mei had snapped out of her stupor and made sure the body was in fact the real deal, it was too late to send anybody after them. Between them, the two were nearly impossible to track due to their experience in hiding their chakra signatures and Fu's knowledge of covering up trails. She sighed again as she carefully made her way over the deck, eyeing any wet patches warily so that she didn't slip up. She made it over, resting her hands firmly on the railing behind the blonde who didn't even look up to acknowledge her. They stood there for a while in rather awkward silence, Naruto not speaking because he had nothing to say, while Fu was silent because she had no idea what to say. It was times like these that fueled her hatred of Takagakure. Maybe if she had a normal childhood she would know what to do in a situation like this. She sighed again, resting her chin against her forearms uselessly. If only she wasn't so socially awkward, or had taken Naruto's advice and gotten to know some of the rebels. Do you think she would have liked this view? Fu actually blinked in surprise as she looked up, shocked at hearing Naruto's voice for the first time in 2 days. He was usually the instigator of their conversations, but with his recent bout of introversion and her general awkwardness, it had been painfully quiet recently. She looked out in the same direction he did, watching the clear blue waves rise and fall, crashing against the bow of the ship. The sight nearly made her lose her lunch as she paled another shade. It depends, would she still like it with dark clouds and constant rain? Unsurprisingly, but still strangely, with Shizuku's death, the rain that had followed them for so long finally abated, the skies clearing up as if to acknowledge the girl's deaths. More surprisingly though, Fu actually saw a small smile pass over Naruto's face, his eyes gaining a hint of melancholy. She had noticed that he hadn't kept his eyes narrowed like he normally did recently. She wasn't sure if it was because he didn't notice or he simply didn't care anymore. You're right, things would be so different if she was still here, if I had just done something to save her. That small smile slowly slipped away as he returned to staring out at the churning waters. His shakuju wasn't at his side, more than likely tucked away in Naruto's cabin. It wasn't like it was going to be stolen. Fu looked at the boy for a moment, indecision racking her features before she finally placed a hand on his shoulder. She wasn't good with people, but she had seen Naruto do it to others before and it seemed to help them. You shouldn't blame yourself, Naruto. She couldn't finish as Naruto suddenly turned on her, finally something other than that horrible look he had been wearing in his eyes, anger. Why not? He pulled his shoulder out from under her hand, his fist down on a railing. The anger didn't last long though, it just wasn't like Naruto. Slowly his face returned to one of sadness as he slumped to the deck, back propped up only by the railing. It's my fault, Fu, it's all my fault. If I had been faster, or more in control, maybe if I had sensed them earlier or had never accepted the mission, if I knew medical ninjutsu, he looked down, his head lolling forward limply, maybe I could have saved her. Fu hesitated a moment before sitting next to him, both just looking down into their laps. Naruto and Fu stared down at the recently upturned earth in front of them, an almost perfect rectangle of 2 feet by 6 feet. Naruto's robes were covered in dried mud from digging the grave and tears still stained his face, making small streams through the dirt on his cheeks. The shovel he had been holding slowly disintegrated away into black dust, some of it falling on the grave itself. Fu stood on the other side, knowing she should be sad but not finding any tears of her own flowing. She hadn't cried since she was a much smaller girl. I think she would be happy with this. The blonde looked up at her but said nothing. They were standing on a high cliff overlooking the shore. A beach stretched out beneath them, and if it wasn't for the recent rain making the entire area feel drab and dismal, it would have been a picturesque scene. It had stopped raining not long after Naruto had finished patting down the last of the earth, although the two were still drenched. He stood up slowly, making Fu follow him up instinctively, and just stood still for a moment. After a moment of some kind of internal debate, he raised one hand, his fingers moving in a complex and dizzying pattern. The ground at the head of the loose earth bulged before bursting out as sand. It began to stream around, compressing and shaping itself until it formed a large, humanoid figure. Fu blinked in surprise when she found herself staring at a beautiful sand sculpture of Shizuku, complete with her trademark kindly smile. Naruto stepped forward and placed a hand on the statue, closing his eyes as blue flame erupted around the hand. Slowly it spread across the sculpture, covering more and more of it in blue flames until it was one large cerulean inferno. Despite the fire itself giving off no real heat, Fu couldn't help but cringe back slightly and worry for Naruto, who was still just standing there, palm pressed against the Shizuku look-alike. When the bright flames finally abated and Fu could lower her hand, her eyes widened in surprise. Instead of a perfect replica of Shizuku made of sand, there instead stood a white marble version of her. He had used Banbutsu Suzo to shift the very structure of the sand into stone, not even using his chakra rods as a medium. It was incredible, and he didn't even look tired after using it. The mint-haired girl marveled at the perfect likeness in silence. It was perfect to the last detail, her clothes even appeared wet and it looked like drops of water clung to her hair. It was exactly as Fu remembered the girl. It's beautiful. Again Naruto remained silent, staring into the lifeless marble eyes of the girl he had cared so much about, and could do nothing to save. For a moment his eyes flickered down to Yagura's soulless corpse to one side, like an intruder at this private moment. It passed as his sad gaze returned to the memorial to his friend. Over time it would wear away, erode and break apart like any statue exposed to the elements, but not while he was alive, not while he still had chakra left. It's my fault too, you know. The blonde looked up, his head coming up out of his wallowing to briefly glance at Fu. This time she was the one with the far-off look, staring out over the reflective water that glittered in the setting sun. Maybe if I had stayed by her side, not left her alone when she wasn't ready yet. Fu surprised herself. She didn't usually speak much, and that might have been the most she had said in a single sentence in a while. She managed a small smile. It felt alien on her face even now after all this time. At least she was avenged though. At that Naruto looked away, one of his hands clenching into a tight fist that had his knuckles turning white. Because I killed him, because I threw away my beliefs and took his life without even stopping to think first. His shoulders slumped forward as he breathed out, his fist unclenching with the exhale. I'm a monster. He blinked lethargically when Fu suddenly appeared in front of him, legs tucked beneath her as her orange orbs pierced his Rinnegan eyes. Naruto, am I a monster? Despite his depression, Naruto's answer was instinctual, almost bred into him by a need to protect those around him from harm, both physical and emotional. Of course not, Fu, you. She suddenly pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him as she looked away towards the deck of the ship, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. The first time I killed was when I was 8 years old. Anything else Naruto might have had to stay suddenly on his tongue as his eyes widened. They woke me up earlier than they usually did, pulling me outside to my training ground. There were people there, People I didn't recognize that were all looking at me in ways I didn't understand. Looking back now, I think it was pity, or maybe anxiety, I'm not sure. She didn't look up as she talked and her voice was low, a whisper as if divulging a secret that shouldn't be spoken. There was a man there too, he looked injured and beaten up. I was brought in front of him and told he was an enemy of Takagakure and therefore deserved to s. They put a kunai in my hand and I didn't even tremble. Naruto could see her hand tighten slightly, a look of regret entering her eye, and the only reason he didn't reach out to comfort her was she still had a hand pressed against his lips. I looked at him for only a few moments, he didn't look up, or talk, or do anything. He just knelt there, I think he had accepted it by then. The girl finally looked up, her orange orbs locking with his own again. Do you know what I thought back then? Naruto couldn't move, he was too transfixed by the way Fu was looking at him, her gaze held so much intensity. I thought, which artery do I see so that B won't get all over me? She looked down again, her eyes losing that fire and becoming dull again, like when Naruto had first found her in that same training ground. It didn't work, that night I had to sleep in clothes drenched in the man's B. I was never told his name, or what he did that deserved his death, I never even asked. It wasn't my last K either. I stopped counting after a while, it just became a number anyway somewhere in the back of my head. I never questioned any of it, just doing it because I didn't want to be punished for disobeying. She looked up again, her eyes steeled as she looked at Naruto. He wondered if she was expecting some kind of reprisal for her words. Am I a monster? Naruto gaped at her speechlessly, mouth struggling to catch up to his mind that was moving a mile a minute. Eventually he shook his head slowly and managed to get a small fleeting smile from the mint-haired Jinchuriki. Then how could you ever be? Naruto opened his mouth to speak again but found his tea oddly dry, his head slumped forward as he returned to staring at his lap. You don't understand, it was different. His shoulders trembled for a moment as he remembered that moment, where he could literally see Yagura dying right before him. I literally held his soul in my hand, I could feel it, everything that made him who he was, his life, his techniques, his memories, I could feel it all. Fu remembered that. At the time she had thought it was a trick of the light, but she swore she had seen Naruto pull some kind of ghostly, ephemeral being from Yagura's body, accompanied by a sickening tearing noise. Look. He raised a hand, slowly, lazily even, he drew a large circle in the air and before Fu's very eyes a large, perfectly clear mirror appeared out of thin air, created entirely from water. That was his technique, I didn't even know it existed before fighting him and now I feel as if I have been practicing it all of my life. Everything he did, all those horrible, unspeakable acts against humanity, he looked up, eyes dull and lifeless. They're inside me now. Fu widened her eyes slightly, it sounded horrible, yet at the same time hugely beneficial. To have all the experience of a cage in mere moment was just unreal. Is it? She trailed off, unsure of how to ask without sounding as though she was prying. After a moment Naruto nodded slowly. Yeah, it's another path, the human path. Naruto gained a faraway look as he spoke, he had never imagined one of his abilities could be that way. That what is, she was see off as Naruto sighed loudly. Please Fu, I don't want to talk about it right now. Fu paused before nodding submissively, it was what she was good at after all. But to be honest Naruto really didn't want to talk about it. If he could he wouldn't even be thinking about it. Just remembering how Yagura's soul felt in his hand, so cold yet filled with life at the same time. His memories were still there, his thoughts and experiences, just beneath the surface. They were suppressed by Naruto's own consciousness so only the things he wanted bled through. Eventually the silence up on the deck became too much. Naruto had finally started talking again and he really didn't want it to go away so soon. Fu. The green-haired girl looked up expectantly, glad that Naruto wasn't completely shutting her out again. While she was poor with social skills she still craved the attention and warmth of others like any other human, she just didn't understand exactly why. What if it changes me? What if I become like him and I change? He nearly jumped when he felt Fu's hand gently rest on his shoulder, meekly raising his eyes to look at her again. Do you feel different? Naruto raised a hand to argue but Fu's penetrating stare made him falter. But later, Fu's glare only increased in intensity and Naruto found anything else he had to say evaporating. Do you feel any different? Naruto could only maintain eye contact with her for another few moments before looking down. No. This time Fu gently raised his head with a finger under his him, a soft smile that was rarely seen on her face crossing her lips. You are still Naruto, and until you decide otherwise nobody and nothing can change that. The blonde blinked rapidly for a second. He had never heard Fu say anything so profound before. He wondered where it came from. Yagura was an evil man. The things he did will probably never be forgiven by those they affected. Many people would see you as a hero for him. Naruto's shoulders slumped again as his head lolled forward. But is that an excuse for taking his life away? I him out of revenge. Now people will look to me in revenge for his death, and if they me then somebody would go after them in revenge again. It's an endless, horrible cycle of hatred and revenge that has no end and will ultimately consume humanity if somebody doesn't stop it. He raised his hands up, placing them on his forehead as his brow furrowed into a deep frown. But humanity is what it is. The cycle has gone on for so long and not even the original sage could stop it. What can I do? He felt Fu settle down next to him, her warm body pressed up against his from the side as she stared out over the sea. You don't need to come up with an answer just yet. You have your whole life still for that. For now just give yourself time to grieve and move on, find a new happiness, new friends. Naruto looked up, eyes widened in shock as he stared at Fu's green tresses from the side. Move on. Fu's mouth set into a soft smile, if only for a moment, before she turned to meet him, managing to give him a small blush at how close their faces were all of a sudden. Shizuku once told me you made her a promise that she would never have to cry again. What makes you think she would want to see you the same way? Naruto looked down, remembering some of the girl's last words to him as she wiped the tears from his eyes. But I broke that promise. I couldn't protect her. He looked up again, startled as Fu suddenly rested her head on his shoulder. It was a little awkward, but she had seen boys and girls do this in some towns they passed through and they seemed to be happy. She thought it might help. No, you didn't. Did she once cry after that? Naruto tried to think back to that moment, despite the pain he felt in his heart as he did so, but sure enough he couldn't remember Shizuku crying even a little as He sighed wearily, his body going slightly limp against the railing, and looked up at the sky, which was beginning to darken as the sun dipped below the horizon behind them. Fu. The girl looked up, her bright orange eyes looking up at him in a way that despite the situation was undeniably cute. Thank you. Her face remained the same as she gave a small nod, noticing the tiny smile at the corner of the blonde's lips. We're friends, aren't we? Naruto simply nodded. Naruto sat in his cabin breathing slowly and deeply. It was a week's trip by boat ride from Mizu no Kuni to Tsuchi no Kuni, and they were currently on the third day. He had finally gotten out of the depressed air he had assumed since Shizuku's death, and although he was still saddened and mourning her, everything seemed a little clearer now. For one, he realized he probably shouldn't have left the rebels like that, without a word. He especially felt bad for not even speaking to Nezumiro after everything the four of them had been through. She probably didn't even know Shizuku was He simply resolved to see her again, which got him to thinking about what the rebels were doing now. Without the Mizukage, he could guess that Kiri was currently panicking. No doubt Mei would take advantage of that. It almost made him laugh that when he had entered Mizu no Kuni he hadn't even known what to expect, or how to help. Yet, in the end he was the one who took down the Mizukage. For all he knew the rebellion was over and Kirigakure was in Mei's hands now. He had always heard people calling her the future godime as if it was a certainty, now at least it was. He shook his head, once again trying to clear his thoughts of any and all distractions as he calmed his breathing and his slightly erratic chakra flow. With his time in the rebellion he had never had all that much time to simply sit back and meditate. He had changed a lot from the monk he had been setting out from the fire temple. Right now he was trying to find his roots again. It wouldn't do for him to return to the temple only to find nobody recognized him anymore. Absently he blew a stray bang of hair from his face. He really needed to get it see soon. Suddenly though he felt a familiar tug and released himself to it. He grimaced at the sight around him. If he had thought these hallways looked bad after assimilating Matatabi, it had nothing on this. Corrosive chakra leaked in almost steady streams from the new pipeline on the ceiling, burning through the floor but luckily without the acrid stench. He grimaced slightly, having been mostly ignoring the pain running through his body. He had been too numbed by Shizuku's death to even care at the time. Right now though he realized that allowing himself to burn from the inside out wouldn't really be productive, not to mention Shizuku would probably admonish him. He almost smiled at the thought before reining it in and focusing intently on his own chakra system. Around him, unnoticed due to his eyes being clenched shut in concentration, the pipes fixed themselves like they were being reversed in time. Rust creeped back before vanishing altogether and new rivets materialized to keep the structure together. When he opened his eyes he no longer felt that dull burn like acid in his veins and the corridor around him was gradually healing from the damage he had allowed to occur. It would take a while to heal completely but he seemed to at least get the new chakra source under control. Speaking of which he frowned as he made his way to the large chamber holding his various tenants. As expected it had remolded itself to accommodate the newcomer, having become a heptagon with the new gate between Metatabes and the Cubies. However the new tenant seemed less than pleased to be there. The Sanbi was roaring madly as it repeatedly bashed its tails against the somewhat weakening bars of its cell. With some panic Naruto realized that the seal was still quite weak from the transfer and all the time he had allowed the new corrosive chakra free reign in his system. Stop. His voice was surprisingly strong, managing to drown out the beast's roar for a moment, only to go completely ignored as the beast continued to thrash against the bars. I said stop. Once again his cry went unanswered, the giant turtle still bashing manically against its jail. Stop. This time it did stop. It was forced as a sudden blast of invisible force sent it skidding back into the darkness of its cell. Thankfully Naruto noticed the bars had immediately begun to repair themselves as he increased his chakra in the seal. However not a moment later the three tails took the opportunity to charge the cell with surprising speed for a creature its size. No to mention it didn't look like the most mobile of animals outside of water. It hit the metal with a sickening screech as the steel bent back under the assault. Once again Naruto sent the enraged turtle back with a Shinra Tensei, this time preventing it from getting any closer than a few feet so it couldn't continue this assault. Now that he had prevented the Biju from harming the seal anymore he could get a good look at it. His memories from after Shizuku's up until he saw Yagura's were crystal clear but seeing the beast while in a rage and seeing it when he was calm allowed him to observe a few more things. For some reason or another one of its eyes seemed permanently closed, but that wasn't what caught his gaze first. No, what he saw were the three tomo spinning angrily on a red background, circling an equally black dot of a pupil. It was an eye that he knew all too well, an eye that had haunted his dreams from a young age in the fire temple. He froze for a moment, but only until another loud and enraged roar snapped him out of it. He immediately rushed forward, his hands onto the bars of the cage and channeling as much chakra as he could muster into them. Immediately the various dents and scraped fixed themselves, the bars looking pristine as if they were new. However at the same time the Sanbi began to thrash about violently, its singular eye darting about in a crazed, panicking manner. Then, suddenly, the Sharingan dissipated simply leaving the creature's normal red eye ringed with a single golden band. When Naruto saw this he backed off from the bars, panting from the exertion of using enough chakra to fully invade a Bijuu's system. He had just used the second method of releasing a genjutsu, a timed burst of his own chakra in the afflicted system. It turned out though that the timed burst was enough chakra to have most cage on their knees from the strain. If Naruto wasn't currently in the seal and this body was actually real he might have collapsed. As it was he simply needed to take a few deep breaths. The Sanbi on the other hand didn't appear to be as lucky. It seemed to take a few confused glanced around the room with its one working eye before it closed, the beast collapsing into exhaustion. Naruto took a few steps back on still rather shaky legs before sitting down in a very messy cross-legged position that would have had any of his senpai from the temple lightly smacking him on the back of his head. What was that? He looked around to see Shukaku looking at him nervously, his large clawed hands ringing around one another, a comical sight if not for the situation. He continued to glance around, spotting Mata to be predictably asleep, having blissfully slept through the entire ordeal. Finally his eyes rested on the Kyuubi, his body hidden away in the darkness of his cell with his eyes cracked open and an unpleasant snarl on his muzzle. That ninjan was the Sharingan, the unfortunate bastardization of the sage's prized eyes. For centuries those damnable eyes have haunted us Biju, ever since the first Uchiha awoke them. Naruto managed to catch his breath as he sat there, watching the Kyuubi's eyes bore into the Sanbi's cell, either in contempt of disgust he couldn't tell, perhaps both. That's right, you can be controlled, can't you? The glare he was sent by the mighty fox was positively as it walked over, bringing its body into the light. I am controlled by nothing, ninja. Naruto just nodded absently, getting a highly irritated and menacing grunt from the fox. So the Sanbi was being controlled. By who? That seemed to placate the fox, or at least redirect its infinite rage onto something other than the small blonde monk. It's unmistakable, the stench of Uchiha Madara permeates the air around Isabu. Naruto filed away the Sanbi's name for later as he turned his attention back to the great fox. Madara, I thought you said yes. The fox grunted again as he lay its head down on its paws in the classic manner. If only the cursed genjutsu of the Sharingan was so easy to break, I would never have fallen under that damn ninjas. The fox trailed off and Naruto knew he had been about to say control before he caught himself. In any case, a genjutsu able to enthrall a biju would naturally be strong enough to last beyond the user's death, that is, if Madara Uchiha is in fact S. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that in confusion, looking to the Kyuubi for clarification. If there was any of you ninja able to slip by the Shinigami, it would certainly be that man, although he would be a frail old man by now. The thought seemed to bring a rather vicious smirk to the Kyuubi's face, obviously picturing his greatest enemy as a withered husk of his former self was quite satisfying. Suddenly though the fox turned, its crimson eyes glaring at the young blonde before him with a newfound malice. Regardless, there is the matter of you forcibly stealing my chakra, ninja. The fox's great maw leaned even closer to the bars of the cage with another grin. Do you not think that validates compensation? A chill ran through Naruto's body as he stared up at those malicious red eyes, staring down at him expectantly. Compensation. The Kyuubi's grin widened as it somehow managed to move his face even closer to the bars of his cell, one of his clawed paws pressing against the metal. Simple, release me from the seal and allow me to tear your body apart quickly and all will be forgiven. Naruto blinked once before staring at the fox blankly for a few seconds. The strange thing was that he understood that the fox killed him swiftly as opposed to with excruciating prejudice was actually a concession on the Kyuubi's part. You're a terrible negotiator for creatures supposed to be sly and cunning. The fox growled, but Naruto knew by now it was half-hearted. It was odd to think of the mighty Biju as joking. Anyway, I have no idea how I would release you at all. I assume it's not quite as simple as just forcing all of your chakra out of my body. He knew that wouldn't work. Such a thing would tear apart his chakra network and probably paralyze him for life, if it didn't just outright kill him. Actually, you could release any of us in the same manner as father did originally. Everybody's attention turned to Matatabi, who had just awoken, stretching out like any feline did after waking from a nap, small or large, or in this case very large. Naruto just responded with a very eloquent nod that showed he had no idea what she was talking about. After the great flaming cat had settled, still luckily awake for now, she sighed. Father used the Banbutsu Suzu to create us B and then allowed our chakra to seep into them slowly over a time. Naruto blinked. He hadn't thought of that, mostly because he had never considered using the sage's most powerful technique to create a living, breathing body. He heard a grunt from the Kyuubi's cage and turned to see the fox had adopted a similar position to his sister. A ninja like him could never master that technique to that degree, he cannot even perform it correctly. Naruto quashed his annoyance at being spoken about like he wasn't there in favor of curiosity. What do you mean not doing it correctly? The fox just snorted and closed his eyes dismissively, making the blonde sigh. He should know better than to think the Kyuubi would ever willingly help him. He means you are only using half of the technique's full potential. The Nibi was met by a loud growl from the fox that merely went ignored by the flaming feline. Telling would be cheating, but to understand you have to know more about how chakra works and what it is composed of. With that, the great cat Biju closed her eyes, yawning loudly as if she hadn't already been asleep for a few days. Naruto on the other hand merely sighed. It all came back to chakra, the very reason he left the temple in the first place. He looked at the Sanbi again. It was still unconscious, so he would have to come back later for answers, but the whole affair with the Sharingan eye had left him rather startled. It brought up a lot of very painful memories he thought he had gotten over, but apparently he couldn't bring himself to truly get over Ayami and Tsuki. He sighed as he looked around again, noticing that Shukaku was oddly quiet and was still wringing his hands in that strange way. He had never seen the giant tanuki so reserved before, It was like the Kyuubi acting submissive, just unsettling. Father. Naruto walked over to the cage, noting that the Kyuubi's eye had cracked open slightly to observe, but he ignored it. Yes, Shukaku. The sand construct ducked down to his normal position with his head close to the bars of the cell so he could look Naruto closer to the eye. Shukaku felt father was angry, and sad. Shukaku sent his sand to help because Shukaku doesn't like when father is sad. Did Shukaku help? Naruto blinked in shock at this odd new side to the Ichibi. It was like he was worried for Naruto. He had thought the Tanuki was merely insane, overlapping his feelings for the sage onto him due to his eyes and, if what he kept saying was anything to go by, his appearance. He remembered clearly the point in his fight when Yagura had been about to impale him with all three of his tails before the sand rose up to stop it without any prompting. Yes, Shukaku, you helped a lot. A soft smile came over his face as he stared up at the now happy features of the enormous Biju. It was strange to think that he could no longer see Shukaku as the immense being of destruction he was hailed as. It was just too outside of the personality he had seen. In many ways it was a lot like the Tanuki really was a child of sorts, although he wouldn't go as far as to say he was Shukaku's father. Shukaku will always protect father just like father protected Shukaku. The being gained a proud grin on his jagged mouth before ducking down as Naruto reached a hand through the bars of his cage. Naruto made sure to rub extra vigorously on the Ichibi's sandy head, just to make sure Shukaku knew his efforts were appreciated, even if he probably could have healed from anything Yagura inflicted by that point. He once again left the seal with a satisfied feeling, with all four Biju currently housed inside of him laying down. Two in unconscious stupors, one taking a nap and the other simply faking as he watched the events with a single red eye. However, the satisfaction was tinged by a few problems that would be racking his brain for the next few days. As usual from his conversations with his tenants, he was left with far more questions than answers. The boat was approaching the end of its journey to Tsuchi no Kuni, and so were its passengers. They had to make a brief stop in Yuki no Kuni for supplies, which gave Naruto and Fu an hour or two to look around the snow-filled port town they stopped off in. It seemed like a nice place, if not too cold and a little quiet for Naruto's tastes, and that was coming from a monk. It hadn't lasted long though, and soon they had continued on their journey to the home of a Wagakur. Naruto had noticed that the brief supply stop seemed to cause problems with a few of the other passengers. After he had gotten out of his depressed stupor, he had been informed that the ship was carrying a film crew on it, quite the prestigious one too. Apparently Yuki Fujika's herself was aboard, although she had refused to come out from the lower decks while the boat was anywhere near Yuki no Kuni. Naruto hadn't really paid it any mind, everybody was entered to their own secrets, although his natural curiosity regarding why an actress would be so distressed about a particular country had been piqued. Ultimately though, it was more of an inconvenience than it was interesting. Every so often during the trip various areas of the ship would be cordoned off. Apparently the director wanted them for various scenes in the movie, and the captain was more than happy to comply on the off chance it would bring more business to his ship. Naruto simply found it irritating when he wasn't allowed to go up on deck in case he interrupted a scene. When he had told them he could become invisible and therefore wouldn't disrupt anything, they had just looked at him strangely. However, the worst thing was the last night on the boat when a sudden inspiration hit the director and he had practically demanded he be allowed to shoot a scene inside Fuu's room, meaning the green-haired girl had to spend the night with him. It didn't help that when he insisted on taking the floor, Fu had simply joined him anyway. Apparently his body heat was much more pleasant than the thin blankets provided by the ship. It was an awkward night for him, although Fu seemed to enjoy herself if the soft smile she wore the next morning was any indication. The blonde didn't really have an issue with Fu sleeping near him, he actually rather enjoyed the company. It was just the fact it reminded him of the nights he had spent with Shizuku which led to him reminiscing and ultimately getting less sleep than he would have liked. On that vein, by the time they arrived at the shore of Tsuchi no Kuni, Naruto had lost enough sleep that he had begun to gain black rings around his eyes that would make Gaara proud. As the boat pulled into the harbor of the astoundingly large port town they had entered into, Naruto could be found sitting in a meditative position up on the top deck, towards the stern of the ship, or at least that was how Fu found him. The ships arrived in Ketsugan Machi. All she got from the blonde was a curt nod, his face maintaining that same look of absolute calm, laced with concentration. She noticed the air around the monk seemed damper than normal, which was strange considering they had been out at sea for the past week. Honestly, Fu was just glad to be getting back onto dry land where the floor wouldn't keep moving beneath her. Flight she could handle, quite well in fact, the sea and anything to do with water transport, not so much. I know, I can feel it. Naruto finally opened his eyes, releasing a small breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The Yondai Mizukage, while a despicable and terrible man, certainly was powerful, and his techniques reflected that. His ability to sense everything around him using water chakra laced through the air was a startlingly useful ability. Naruto sort of imagined it was close to what a Byakugan user saw when using the Dujutsu, except it was probably closer to echolocation. Of course, Naruto's water affinity was not nearly as strong as Yagura's, so he could so far only stretch his senses out around 200 meters while sitting still. However, within that range, Naruto could detect everything in a similar way to how he could feel chakra signatures through his sand. He had felt Fu approaching him as soon as she had left her bed. It wasn't the clearest picture, more like a fuzzy outline at best, but he could also feel her chakra signature. The technique was also weak where there was less water vapor in the air, but on a ship out at sea that wasn't really an issue. Alright, let's go. Fu nodded happily. He had noticed that since he had come out of his own depressed shell, Fu seemed to open up more around him emotionally. He couldn't be sure if she was doing it in an attempt to comfort him or she felt some kind of guilt at Shizuku's death. Either Naruto rather liked the change from the normally expressionless Kanoiki to a more relatable teenage girl. The two quickly made their way off the ship, noting that the film crew wasn't far behind them. It made Naruto wonder what film the director could be shooting if he had to come to Earth Country. It wasn't exactly known as the most aesthetically pleasing place. Either way, he ignored them as the two set off into the rather large town that was famous for its fishing industry and shale export. It was a veritable trading hub that Iwagakure regularly capitalized on. They liked to use it as a base to send their shinobi teams off on their long-distance missions, at a discount from the captains, of course, due to the protection the shinobi offered. After 10 minutes, Naruto realized he had been relatively lost in his thoughts as the two aimlessly wandered through the town. Fu, of course, had been obediently following him, naturally trusting him wherever he was going, as she had been since Taki. He stopped in the middle of the streets, only Fu's advanced shinobi-trained senses preventing her from walking straight into his back. He looked around, noting they had entered some kind of shopping district before making a beeline for the nearest cafe. A few minutes later and Naruto was quite happily sipping on some tea while Fu was content with water. It was something Naruto found amusement in given her aversion to sea travel. He sighed as he leaned back in the seat, idly glancing around at the people eating and drinking around them. He saw families and couples, men that looked like they were waiting for business partners of maybe clients, all together in one place. So what now? Fu had remained quiet up until this point, but she had finally voiced the thought that had been plaguing Naruto for the last few minutes. Finally, with slightly frustrated sigh, he leaned back forward, staring despondently into his tea. I'm not sure. He rolled his N once, noting that he had somehow drawn the attention of a few older patrons in the cafe. I would recommend going to Iwa and working on earth manipulation, but honestly my master warned me of that. Apparently I bear too much of a resemblance to the Yondai Hokage and it might not be safe for me. Naruto quietly sighed at the thought. At the start of his journey he might have paid no heed to those words. After all, he was a monk. He had faith in humanity to look past such petty things as physical appearance or resemblance. Of course his journeys had enlightened him in a way. Now he was sure that people accosting him purely for looking like a man who had simply done his job in service of his country was perfectly possible. The thought wasn't exactly welcome in his idealistic mind, but it was definitely there. He now realized that humanity simply had a darker side he could no longer blissfully ignore. This realization had of course been a product of fighting in a horrendous war built on the back of paranoia and ignorance. Is there anywhere else you could learn earth manipulation? Naruto paused for a moment as his gaze returned to Fu, his eyes focusing intently on the girl for a few moments as a few thoughts ran through his mind. Why are you following me, Fu? The girl looked genuinely startled at the question, her large orange eye widening in surprise. What do you mean? Naruto sighed wearily as he resumed staring into his cup of tea, watching as the distorted reflection of the sky wobbled as he moved the cup. What do you gain from being with me? So far I have nearly put you in trouble with Kumogakure and dragged you into a civil war you could have in. He looked up, sadness brimming his rippled eyes. I don't want you to follow me to your death, Fu. The mint-haired girl relaxed slightly, exhaling in relief. She had thought Naruto was abandoning her, and honestly, she wasn't sure she could take that. It would most likely shatter what little emotional stability she had left. Like Shizuku, Naruto visibly flinched at her unintentionally accusing tone that wasn't really directed at him. He refused to meet her gaze as her eyes continued to bore into the side of his head, tracing the outlines of his spiky locks. Naruto, what happened to Shizuku was not your fault. Again his eyes refused to come up and meet hers. She chose to follow you because you saved her from a life infinitely more terrible than anything else. She followed you because she saw something in you that made her want to follow you. If you're at fault, it's for just being an amazing person who would think about others before himself. Finally, Naruto's head raised a little, his eyes peering up curiously. Then why do you follow me? He saw a soft smile alight on the Jinchuriki's lips. Naruto had to admit she looked incredibly cute like that. Because while I didn't see that same quality at first, you were there for me long enough that I was able to. Her smile took on a more melancholic hint, but her eyes never strayed from his. For that alone I will continue to follow you, no matter what you say. Finally a small smile tweaked the edges of the blonde's lips as he sat a little straighter in his chair. Thanks, Fu. He sighed deeply and drank down the rest of his tea. It's good to know I have a real friend with me. The mint-haired girl simply nodded with a rather satisfied smile on her features as she casually sipped at her glass of water. Although that doesn't really help with where we're supposed to go next. Fu eyed her head slightly, her eyes drifting away lazily in thought. There may be a library with earth manipulation techniques in Tsuchi no Kuni's capital. The mint-haired girl shrugged slightly as she talked. She was grasping at straws as much as Naruto was. The blonde could only return the shrug in kind as he scooted his chair back and stood up, allowing Fu to down her water as they left the cafe. It's worth a shot. I think Iwa should be a last resort. Fu nodded. It wasn't hard for her to spot the resemblance between Naruto and Minato Namikaze. She had been taught about many of the previous powerful Kage and other notable shinobi as part of her training. Usually it involved strategic exercises on how to counter many of their more famous techniques. However, there was no known counter for the Hiraishin no Jutsu, part of what made the Yondaime Hokage so formidable. He could literally KO you before you had even begun to realize he was there. In fact, many of the old legends of the shinobi world, those like Madara Uchiha, the Shodaime Hokage, the Nadaime Tsuchikage and Mizukage and the Sandaime Reikage, were still recognized as the most powerful shinobi to ever live, including those alive today. Many of their techniques were still puzzled on, and people found themselves hard-pressed to come up with counters many years after the deaths. In each case it had taken them either K each other, in the case of the first four, or simply overwhelming force, in the case of the Sandaime Reikage, for them to finally be defeated. I agree. The two once again moved through the village, this time with purpose as they made their way west. Still, with only the jingle of Naruto's shakuju breaking the silence between them, it became rather awkward. It made Naruto miss the idle chatter Shizuku could always come up with, or the various strange noises Masaru would make. The little capuchin had disappeared sometime after Shizuku's death, or maybe Naruto had simply forgotten him in his depressed haze. Either way, he somewhat missed the little presence perched on the end of his staff. Their small moment of peace couldn't last long though, as Naruto felt a multitude of signatures slowly begin to surround them. Their chakra levels, from what he could detect through the air and through the ground, definitely put them as shinobi but not particularly powerful. If he had to guess, he would say they were a squad of relatively new chunin. He looked over to see Fu's eyes looking around slightly more attentively than before. It seemed she had noticed as well. Naruto sighed and turned into a nearby alleyway, intentionally drawing out whoever was following them. Look what we got here, boys. Another small sigh escaped the blonde's lips as 6 men, barely over 20, dropped down from the nearby roofs. A moment later he quirked an eyebrow as he looked up at one of the roofs before returning his attention back to the men, adopting his kindly monk persona with his eyes narrowed and a serene smile on his face. Can I help you, Shinobi-san? Fu had to suppress a scoff as she stood back boredly. This was a boy who had single-handedly taken down a Kage, a Jinchuriki no less, and he was being polite with a bunch of ruffian chunin. The poor fools had no idea what they were playing with here. They never even noticed as a small wall of sand appeared at either end of the alleyway, blocking it off from the rest of the town. Yeah, I suppose you could. The leader of the bunch, as there always was, sneered contemptuously at the small blonde. He was a fairly unimpressive man with lank black hair scraped back into a very small top knot and small beady black eyes. The rest were just as forgettable, each wearing the standard Iwa uniform of a dull earthen flak jacket and the single-sleeved tunic beneath it. With some curiosity the monk noted that the girl near the back of the group seemed decidedly more nervous than the others, anxiously fumbling with her hands. You see, my companion happened to notice a certain monk walking around that bore a rather striking resemblance to the Yondaime Hokage. The man sneered again in a rather unpleasant manner that Naruto only raised his brow briefly. Rather annoyed his intimidation hadn't worked, the shinobi continued. You know who that is, right? The monster that butchered thousands of Iwa shinobi in the Third Great Shinobi War. Naruto raised his other brow to match the first before sighing visibly. I would call it narrow-minded to consider a shinobi people monster-like behavior, but I can understand how it may appear that way. Of course, forgetting that it happened during a war where multiple Konoha shinobi also as well is rather ignorant. The man blinked for a moment, as did a few of his companions, before a nasty look crossed over their features, the first already reaching for a kunai. Are you calling me an idiot? Naruto smiled softly, catching more than a few of the shinobi off guard with the kindly gesture. Of course not. Ignorance is very different from stupidity. Ignorance would be attacking me merely for a resemblance to a man simply doing his duty to protect his village, as any loyal Iwa shinobi would have done in his place or situation. His smile never left his face as he spoke, but his eyes took on a decidedly harder glint as he looked up at the leader of the group, not that the man could see that. Stupidity would be attacking me at all. While his first words seemed to give all the shinobi pause, especially the Kunoiki at the back, the last one seemed to send the men over the edge. Why, you little brat? The man pulled out his kunai only for it to immediately fly from his hand, straight into Naruto's awaiting palm. The blonde looked at it curiously for a moment as the other shinobi stopped, amazed by whatever Naruto had done. Did you know the kunai was never originally a weapon? Simply a multi-purpose tool. It was ninja that turned something used for manual labor and levering into a method of K. The blonde sighed as the Iwa nin seemed to regain their composure, irked at Naruto's lecturing tone. Humans are so good at that, it make me wonder how we survived for so long being as self-destructive as we are. He absently tossed the small weapon to the side just as another slid into the lead shinobi's hand. Tessai, maybe we should. The Kunoiki flinched as the leader of the group turned to her with an angry glare. Shut up, Manabe, we need to teach this disrespectful brat a lesson. The Kunoiki faltered under the man's gaze. She personally was perfectly fine with leaving the boy alone, even if he did bear a startling resemblance to the yellow flash. It was that way with many Iwa residents. They had moved on. Or at least they had understood the very points the young monk was trying to get across. Still, Tessai was her captain and she would be charged for insubordination if she refused to at least follow him. Luckily, as the team medic, she was under no obligation to fight, something she greatly appreciated only a few minutes later. When the first Iwa shinobi rushed in, a rather stout man that was obviously not expecting much resistance from a young monk based on his pulley jab, it was like a switch had been flicked. Moments before the man was anywhere close to hitting Naruto, the boy had already slipped into his stance. He slid around the punch, dropping between the man's legs in an impressive display of flexibility before flipping him gently so he came to a rolling stop on the ground. Naruto stood back up, the Iwa Chunin did not. He was almost completely drained of chakra. Fu smiled involuntarily at the sight. She hadn't seen Naruto use that style for a while. During the war he had favored the more aggressive, but equally non-lethal, Kaminari no Mai. It was better for dealing with multiple opponents, as long as they could actually get close to Naruto, which was a rarity in itself. In this case she knew Naruto was strictly using taijutsu so that the shinobi had nothing strange to report when they went back to their commanding officer. He was most likely using the Mizu no Mai, so there would be no visible evidence of actual conflict, lessening his chances there would be reprisals against him for assaulting Iwa shinobi. Mari. Another of the men rushed forward, this time not underestimating the young blonde as he came forward with a much more disciplined sweeping kick, for all the good it did him. Naruto simply dived at the man, redirecting the two quick punches aimed at his face with well-timed before simply grabbing the man's head. In a few moments the man was unconscious, lacking the chakra to even stay awake. Naruto had found via experimentation that his preta path not only worked better through direct contact, but by aiming in an area with one of the hachimen, the celestial gates that regulated mass chakra flow, he could drain a normal shinobi in a few seconds. Further conflict can be avoided if you simply take your comrades and leave my friend and me alone. All he received were 3 glares and a rather meek look from the Kanoiki, who was astounded by the skill shown from the young blonde. Damn you brat, I'll teach you to mess with a Wagaku. Naruto only sighed, not bothering to point out that they had been the ones to strike first, knowing his words would fall on deaf ears. This time 2 of them moved forward at the same time, their similar features possibly making them brothers or twins, as if numerical superiority might give them an edge. Naruto quickly put down that idea as he deftly spun underneath the first blow, redirecting the force of the punch downwards to offset the man's balance. He used the man as leverage to flip over him, avoiding a similar attack from the brother as he planted a hand on the back of the first. Using that as a base, he performed a one-handed handstand, simultaneously draining the man beneath him so that by the time he landed behind the second brother he dropped to the floor, exhausted. By the time the second one turned, Naruto had already gracefully followed the movement, staying behind the man as he grabbed the back of his head. It was always the best place for his preta path due to the presence of 2 gates, the Kaiman and Kuman. Ao had been surprisingly helpful when he was unraveling these oddities with his preta path, explaining the location, function and various uses of the gates. There were a few members of the rebellion that could actually open a few, no more than a third though, who also proved to be informative. Naruto had yet to actually delve into opening any of the gates, but it was definitely something for him to ponder later. Back to the fight though, if you could call it that, and the leader of the group who had hung back until now saw the folly in attacking Naruto. However, he made a mistake in assuming that Fu was the weaker of the 2, she was, but that didn't make her weaker than him. A few seconds later saw the man on the ground, clutching at his eyes in agony before Naruto promptly walked over and finished the job. He looked up, not even looking remotely winded, as 5 Iwachunin lay on the floor, all of them completely incapacitated without so much as a scratch. He specifically looked at the Kanoiki, who looked back with a mixture of fear and awe. Naruto really didn't like that look, it disturbed him somewhat to think people might actually fear him when he meant no harm. You are welcome to tend to your teammates if we can leave in peace. The Kanoiki seemed hesitant, technically by attacking her comrades, despite them initiating, he was her enemy. Yet at the same time she both had no wish to fight and knew she was completely outclassed here. With a small nod she quickly scurried over to the nearest of her unconscious teammates, allowing Naruto and Fu to calmly walk out of the alleyway, nobody noticing as the walls of sand dispersed harmlessly. A few minutes later and Naruto stopped, purposefully looking up at a nearby rooftop. Moments later and from that very spot a man jumped down, landing solidly in a horse stance. Fu could tell just by the way he moved he was both powerful and well trained, a Junin at least, nothing like the Chunin back there. If this came down to a fight she wasn't sure Naruto could get by purely on taijutsu. Hey, pretty good Gaki, not a lot of people can detect me when I don't want to be found. Naruto calmly observed the man in the moments he could. He seemed friendly enough, but he was obviously a shinobi and lying was kind of in their job description. He was an average-sized man with spiky maroon hair done up in a bristly ponytail with a messy mustache and beard. He wore a rather simple purple kimono top with brown armor slung over, reminiscent of the older armor of the first shinobi wore. The most notable feature was the wooden headpiece tapered into a 3-point crown and a black piece of molded metal running across his nose. Can we help you, Shinobi-san? Resuming his peaceful monk routine seemed rather pointless given that the man had been watching him fight those Iwa shinobi, but Naruto rather liked to act that way. Sometimes he could just lose himself in the role and actually pretend he was just a normal monk for once. Oh, how he wished that was true sometimes. I don't know yet, why don't we walk for a while? Naruto shrugged and the man gestured a specific direction, away from the town. It was where Naruto and Fu were going anyway, so the small blonde agreed. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, my companion is Fu. The stout redhead nodded his acknowledgement as they walked, not breaking stride for a moment as they passed the boundary of the town. You can call me Rushi. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.